Next up, I'm proud to introduce our keynote speaker, Sean Atkinson. He's the CISO for the Centre of Internet Security. Sean will discuss approaches to integrating risk assessment with patch management and showcase a risk-based framework that ensures sustainable, effective patch management, aligning IT operations and security priorities to stay ahead in a constantly evolving threat landscape. So, Sean, take it away.
Thank you, Graham. My name is Sean Atkinson, CISO at the Centre for Internet Security. I'm here really today to give some thoughts in terms of both remediation, patching, and looking at our threat landscape. So what I'm proposing here is to balance some of our risks, the rewards, and remediation strategies. So we move in, just wanted to give a really brief agenda, looking at really the objective of what we're trying to identify when we look to perform the balancing in that area. So ultimately, we're addressing vulnerability. We want to look at strategic timing to implement patching and patch management. Now, the reason to do this strategic timing is to balance both risk and stability of our underlying infrastructure. Therefore, we can integrate IT and security efforts, even leading us to elements of automation and orchestration. The important element here is also to educate, right, stakeholders in the space to, one, allow us an ability and an understanding to balance the risk, introduce stability as part of an entire program, then also continuously improve. This helps build a security culture. And ultimately here, I want to provide some metrics, some great metrics from CISA and the Verizon DBIR in terms of looking at these elements and why vulnerability needs to be addressed and why we need to build that security culture. So ultimately here, we're looking at balancing risks, right? We want this risk-based framework so we can look at vulnerability, address it as part of our vulnerability management program where patch management strategy integrates robust remediation. The robust is required because it's not just a one-time thing. This is a continuous process that we want to build to elements of preventative type capability. Now, it's not always predictive, but as we can start to address and look at our threat landscape, we can maybe then identify underlying systems where we want to control respectfully our assets and identify criticality, be able then to provide a risk-based approach to balance operationalization as well as security management. So effectively, we need to address and work with internal stakeholders. We need to address processes, we need to contextualize risk, and then ultimately, where we define resources. This has to be operationally identified in order to create the balance, right? So we're all about balance with our respective process. So not just raw policy, but ultimately an operationalized approach where we can then understand the needs of our stakeholders, IT operational requirement, and then security priorities. And these are required. This understanding and alignment is needed because we're in a constantly evolving threat landscape. And I'll show some of the thoughts here with known exploited vulnerabilities from CISA's identification, as well as some of the dwell time of vulnerabilities within environments. Now, I want to address the vulnerability. And so where we have our balance is where now with this particular diagram, I want to introduce some of the concepts. So we've got the contextualized element of our infrastructure where we see exposure, but then also criticality in terms of our reaction. So the context is we need the feedback of the business. In a lot of cases, our stakeholders in this respect. So we get the context of the underlying system to define what is exposed, therefore leading us to a balance of risk. Now we have to go to remediation where we see criticality. So we're working with our IT operations personnel in terms of defining what is most vulnerable. We then come back to a risk mitigation strategy and where we get into that preventative approach, where we see issues for particular infrastructure at levels of criticality that may be even high or ultimately the level of critical, we need to address those approaches. And this allows us, one, prioritization. We want to enable the business, but we also want to protect the business. We want to address risk. So we have to adapt and understand our exposure. Now, in some cases, when we do that balance, the middle piece here is quite important. So our risk-based approach is not only taking the context and then ultimately the criticality of the underlying system and infrastructure, but then looking at our threats. So utilizing some threat intelligence and threat modeling to define where we see that. That gets into elements of preventative capability, allowing us then to move that into the critical processes. So we come up again for our reward, as it were. So we've got patching as part of our preventing exploitation of respective environments. Now that leads to one, maintaining the integrity. So that is, in some cases, part of our CIA triad is we've got to introduce the integrity of the underlying processing through patch management. And, patching is not just necessarily vulnerability, but capability in terms of functionality with respective systems. So we utilize that in order to address the business need. So from context, we understand our exposure. Now we can operationalize that to know our systems. So if we're fans of the CIS controls, we want control number 1 and number 2 in terms of understanding our systems. So we'll really manage that exposure. So we want to look at the exploitability of underlying systems and basically align that to a risk-based process. So we're looking at these key systems. So we've contextualized, we know the key systems, but we also know the criticality of the integration of those key systems. Very, very important. Leads us to elements of business process management, diagramming certain data flows within respective systems, helps us get an understand of that context. And one, build necessarily a security culture based on a diagramming process, but we can feed that context back to the business who may not necessarily understand their part of the entire infrastructure, right? We're trying to think holistically. And so ultimately it leads us to the remediation of these exposures. And so bringing that together is protecting sensitive data. Obviously, from a business context, we've identified what that is. We want to prevent the data breaches. So what are the tactics, techniques that are used from an exploitability perspective? And then the criticality leads us as to where is the greatest damage for our organization with respect to that context and exposure. So we think strategic timing. So now this is an important element. We have to address critical patching as a process. We have to integrate that because we have certain systems that are going to be exposed and are going to be completely vulnerable no matter, the multiple layers of defense and depth that we have put in play. Okay, so we need to understand where that exists in our infrastructure, how many layers of defense exist, and what are we seeing, and I've put here exploited in the wild. And so that's where we're starting to get feedback from the threat intelligence community in terms of what are they seeing and what is our reaction. Now, we take that reaction as part of the middle part of our exposure perspective and see, are we exposed to this? If it has nothing to do with me, we're not using the system, okay, good, we can move on. But in a lot of cases, there's a lot of proliferating technology that really we have to pay attention to. And so it's using that as an element of security culture that we'll talk about later. But we've got to get into our regular patching cycles, right? So we have, Patch Tuesdays, our monthly updates, and we're making sure that one, the when to patch is when we have both critical and we're on a regular patching cycle so that we've got a process that we can understand that we're not introducing necessarily these variables into our environment that could cause issues for operating respectfully the systems, right? Our underlying infrastructure. So when I use a risk-based prioritization approach, here's our balance. We've got to introduce risk into this process, but it's balanced by these most severe vulnerabilities. So we know what exists in terms of what needs to be patched, and we're basing that on risk. So we add context, but we also add criticality. So we create a balance across the process. Now, when don't we patch? Now, this is a very, very important consideration for certain environments. Now, we want to avoid immediate patching in production environments without necessarily thorough testing. You may define criticality as part of our process and say, these systems require some continuity, and we have to be very diligent in the way we apply patches. because again, some patches potentially could introduce new bugs or compatibility issues to your environment. So we've got to be aware of that. This is part of the balance. It's not just set it and forget it, right, with a patch. It's understanding and the contextualizing ultimately your environment. And then for non-critical systems, is it okay to delay patching? Are we going to prioritize critical and then non-critical systems will come to when we get an opportunity? And ultimately, we've got risk preventative, risk mitigation strategies in play that we may have more defense in depth, or ultimately, respectfully, these systems are not exposed to the same level of threat as others, right? Depends on where they are in our environment in terms of how we then address ultimately the stability and the continuity of our processes. So that leads us to another element of balance where we're then looking at the metrics. So I pulled this from cvedetails.com. If you've not been, great information in terms of the number of CVEs by year. So I actually give you the browse by date link here. What we're seeing, so you can look, we're seeing upward trend, right? Ultimately, there's some outliers with 2015, 2016. Maybe the exploit developers took time off, but they came back with fervor in 2017. And we can see a continuous update in terms of the number of identified CVEs by year. And we look at 2024, when I pulled this, we're just under 20,000, probably over 20,000 now. And you can see it's probably another record setting year in terms of the CVEs identified. But what does that lead us to, right? So we're talking preventative and we're talking balance. So I need this type of intelligence to understand that certain systems need to have an appropriate approach to both context, the underlying exposure, and then the criticality. If I define those as part of a risk-based approach, sets me up for success, and we want to permeate that through the organization. We want to use these numbers not for fear, but for integration of these processes into our daily cybersecurity culture. And we need to build that culture in our organization. In a lot of cases, we could put a policy together, introduce that to people. Here, this is the newly distributed policy. This is what we're going to follow. Okay, you may get some traction, but the way I feel about this is we've got to make it real. So obviously you hear about the use cases, right? Well, we're going to use what happened to others in order to inform what we should be doing today. That has some effect, but ultimately not the greatest integrated approach. I think it's better than just a policy. So you could do policy, here's use cases, but here are the numbers. Here is what we're seeing. And being able to identify that, I think, adds another element. Now, is it going to convince everybody? Absolutely not. But the element here, in my perspective and the way I work and talk to both technical personnel, executives, is trying to get their perspective in line with where I see things going. Now, again, I could be risk averse, right? It's just part of my role as a CISO. I want to do things. I want to have a plan. I don't want to introduce new technologies. Every new technology is more vulnerabilities in my mind. Okay, well, very pessimistic. But I've got to approach it with this risk-based element, right? Because I've got to have the context of the business in mind when making these decisions. The reward is to be able to integrate those capabilities into my security program, be able to understand what does it mean from an exposure perspective, and then how critical are these systems. That then helps me reframe the balanced approach to the risk-based framework. I have to balance, and so it's not the Department of No. Obviously, that's an old moniker that we have, and potentially some still. But we've got to move into an area where it's yes, but I need to understand the context. I need to understand what kind of exposure this could bring to the organization, and I need to know its criticality. That helps you make better decisions in this space. So when we come back, we balance risk. So what have I just done? So I've evaluated the risk associated with each vulnerability. So I've gone abstracted to where I was talking about an infrastructure perspective. Now I'm coming back to where I see the CVE details reports, right? And we're looking at vulnerability, and I'm considering factors such as the exploitability, looking at the potential impact, and our exposure level. These three elements help me balance and address the right way to approach vulnerability management within the organization. Where does this fit into our organization's day-to-day, right? We could have a CVE come out and ultimately grade 10, as it were, from a CVSS score. Again, depending on if you're using version 2 or 3, they change. But let's say it's a 10. It comes in, and now ultimately, this is my reaction. What am I going to do? So we've got to ask questions. We contextualize. So I'm looking at the exploitability. Ultimately, that turns into my exposure, right? Because I'm looking at the potential impact on business operation, then looking at exploitability, and then looking at my exposure level. That helps me contextualize what we need to do to approach certain vulnerability. And we can't be in this space. And again, I want to reiterate this as part of a cultural element, but this is not always raising the red flag at every opportunity. It's utilizing balance in order to address that. When I do raise the red flag, it's done with consideration, it's done with this balanced effect of risk assessment and impact review. And ultimately, then it should have a reaction from the organization. That's what we're looking to build, is a reaction. Ultimately, if Sean thinks this is, highly potentially an issue, we've then got to move into the space and work with him in order to address it. Now, in some cases, I may raise the red flag and it's nullified by certain control, certain risk mitigation strategies, certain exposures are mitigated with what we've implemented as a control framework. That's great. That gives me feedback to understand the next time I'm assessing, I now have contextualized. I can now think through, is this similar? Let me memorialize what we just did here in terms of a lessons learned. Now, I will say it's learned because I've got to reuse it. It's lessons identified, and if I don't use it, well, I've not really learned anything. So I've got to use that in order to maintain this element of stability, because I've got to ensure that patches and testing, we've got controlled environments, and we're looking at deployment strategy. I want to avoid system disruption as much as possible. But there are some situations where we need to address the risk because it's so high. This is the balance, right? There are some risks that are just beyond my appetite, beyond my tolerance, and I've got to move into a space where we can upgrade and patch systems. What we should have, and this is not always possible, and so, I talk about balance, and we've got to address this, but rollback plans. Now, that's easy to say, not easy to execute. But over time, these should be your lessons learned in terms of dealing with specific systems. So I would look at those critical systems, look at the potential and the capability of rollback plans in that space. This doesn't go right. If we configure it wrong, if the download that we took is corrupted and is causing an issue, what are we going to do to revert? Those are part of necessarily business continuity. And we've got to introduce that here as part of this balancing element. So it's not just addressing vulnerability, but it's also addressing our system itself. And so that's the life cycle, that's minimizing disruption, that's looking at our recovery point objective, recovery time objectives, looking at the business impact analysis, as it were, of these representative systems. Ultimately, we've got to balance to minimize risk without necessarily sacrificing system stability. Very, very important. Not easy to do by no means, but important to address. So I've mentioned where we integrate IT and cybersecurity efforts. So we want a collaborative framework. So we want to foster that collaboration. This builds continuity between respective teams. Now, depends on the organization of your org structure, right? IT and cybersecurity may be together, may be within the same team. Not that I've seen, but potentially. Ultimately, what we have to do is, when we have teams that are under separate management, is clear communication and shared goals. Ultimately, there's your balance, right? We've got to bring in the balanced approach here, and it not just be an initiative that the information security team is pushing. This is a joint shared effort. So we have to have these unified processes. There is no patch management without IT. Ultimately, there is no awareness of the requirement for patching. Again, I use that delicately, without cybersecurity and information security processes. Coming together, ultimately, I'm well aware that IT operational organizations are fully aware of the patch management requirements and vulnerabilities that exist. But I want to do that more collaboratively. We should be doing that in a shared structure because then I think that sets a new foundation of security culture within an organization, collaboration, participation, and really having each other's backs in the space is very, very important. It moves then to shared metrics and reporting, and this solidifies that is where we're sharing metrics with the organization on performance. Here's identification, here's context we received, here's our exposure, here's criticality. This is what we've done to address this underlying risk. We build it from a risk-based perspective because it allows us to communicate more broadly than just a technology perspective, more than just a individual system perspective. Now, the stakeholder of that system, very appreciative. Thank you for keeping it up, making us protected, secured, and that we're fully operational. Wonderful. But for everybody else, maybe not as important, right? Until it's their system. That's why we address it from a risk-based perspective. Get that broad communication out to the whole organization and make it, an impression in a lot of cases in terms of what we've done. And the transparency really helps in the space because ultimately, you know, I'll use this, and again, I'll get the groans, but this is fine. It's not a matter of if, but when, right? And so they are going to need to work with you. All these other stakeholders at some point are going to need to work with you in this space, addressing vulnerability, the need for patching, and minimizing system disruption. So it's good to get that transparency and ultimately seeing the methods that are required. It does lead me to where there's continuous improvement. And one of the things that we can look at is automation. So we can look at automated patching to streamline, ultimately reducing, again, human error in this process and ensure timely updates. Now, timely updates have to be with the caveat of tested and approved ability to deploy. But we can do that necessarily in a cloud infrastructure. We may have staging environments that we can test and practice and use this as a preventative approach. So when we do have one of those critical issues against a critical system, we can address it timely. So there's an element of practice here. But getting it to automated, then we just practice the institution of the automated management capability, and then we schedule, right? So one of the things we use is off-peak hours, right, to minimize disruption. It's a great approach, but it also leads us to orchestration, so where we can look at coordinating patches really across diverse environments. In a lot of cases, you may have hybrid on-prem cloud infrastructure that you're looking to control from certain perspectives and have to monitor and operationalize continuously. And so we want to use orchestration as well to make sure we've got consistency. And this is the big piece that I bring in as part of the balance review, as it were, is that we have to be consistently deploying, because ultimately it's that one system that you don't is going to be the one that gets you in a lot of cases. So we've got to be consistent in terms of how we're treating those systems, especially if they're all classified as critical. Ultimately, we've got to address them consistently. And with orchestration, the other element again is to reduce that complexity. So I mentioned diagramming. I'm a big fan of the diagramming processes to understand, manage, and control certain infrastructure. It allows me to understand and obtain that information to make decisions. So it helps me contextualize. But then I also want to reduce that complexity to understand the specific exploitability of certain vulnerabilities within our systems. What is this going to impact? Let's start to think about that as we look from contextualize all the way through critical infrastructure. We need to educate. What I've done here is I've pulled out culture a little bit because I want to talk about it separately, but I've combined policy and training. So awareness, I want to educate stakeholders, make sure that permeates layers of an organization about the importance. And again, that's why I want to use a risk vernacular in order to communicate. So this will help executives and non-technical staff. We got to emphasize timely patching, and again, looking at those metrics in order to identify. And we'll go through one more shortly. We look at policy development. So I mentioned that we need policy would be the first start and may not permeate. We need stories, we need metrics, we need something to tell about the importance. But without a policy, it's not memorialized, it's not brought into the organization's risk-based framework. Frameworks live on policy. And so we've got to use those in order to help communicate throughout the organization. Also creates an element of transparency in a lot of cases. But then we come back to feedback loops. So we want to continuously improve. We want to solicit input both from IT, cybersecurity, ultimately our stakeholders in a lot of cases, but we do that as part of our balancing process. But we need to work really as a team through IT operations and security. We can do that through post-patch analysis. We can look at the effectiveness of the patches, any residual issue. We can then analyze and memorialize what we've done. So this is where we start to get to our lessons identified, move them into lessons learned, right? Get them as part of your program so that they're integrated. Without having them integrated, you've not learned anything. And so getting feedback loops are great, but we've got to do something with them. And allowing us to do that through post-patch analysis really helps improve future deployments, especially when we're thinking automation and orchestration. Doing that sets us up for success. Let's get to that preventative element as soon as we can. Now, I mentioned culture, so we'll take the part of the circle here, the pie chart for culture. We want to look at prioritization, right? Again, I'm maybe harkening on too many elements here of getting this communicated through risk-based vernacular, but we have to understand the seriousness of patching. And the reason I say that is we've been trying to conquer patching for the past 30 years, and we're still talking about it. We've got to do more in terms of building that into our culture. And that could be through recognition and incentive. If we can do this successfully, we can then provide motivation that this is part of what we need to do in order to maintain our current operational capability and move forward as an organization with the preventative. In a lot of cases, this is reactive because we need ultimately that vulnerability to be identified. But we want to get to close to, we can call it preventative as a way to move this program forward, and that it's contributing something back to the organization. It has value. That value needs to permeate multiple layers of the organization from the top all the way down to those identified as stakeholders who are providing us context, and for us to utilize cyber threat intelligence to make and build an awareness strategy. That's going to help us define the underlying risk and help us build criticality into our processes. Now, I've got a few little metrics as we start to close out the session today. But I want to look at the Ponemon Institute. So we're looking at separating truths and myths in cybersecurity. This comes from 2018, but we're still here. Is one of my points. This has the problem is this statement has aged well. And I don't want it to age well, but it has. But poor patch management practices need to be improved because poor patching can lead to data breaches. We've got respondents here at 68% believing because patch management is poorly executed, it's leading to data breaches. And we see that all the time. There's enough case studies that we should be well versed in the fact that certain elements of our patching processes need to be improved. I'm going to go now to the Verizon Data Breach Investigation Report. Absolutely phenomenal publication. What we have here is it takes around 55 days. Let's one more time, 55 days to remediate 50% of the critical vulnerabilities once patches are available. Not identifying the fact that vulnerability exists, but 55 days to implement. Okay. Now, I've got a little quote. It's a little bit facetious, but anyway. So if you're questioning the utility of a good patch management program, you better make sure you really understand business continuity and disaster recovery. You're doing the patch management to prevent the need to go into elements of DRBC. We've got to do this, and you've got to work through a cultured process. And here's just another metric, time to patch. Ultimately, this is where I got the 55 days, 50% of vulnerabilities unremediated. Got the link here to the Verizon Data Breach Report. Again, if you have not read it, this is part of your cyber threat intelligence. This is providing you context and looking at your exposure from a risk-based perspective. These are the metrics that need to be reviewed. So this is the survival analysis of the key of the known exploited vulnerabilities, known exploited vulnerabilities. Very important. This is known and they've been used to exploit. And these are the types of percentages that we see from the research that Verizon did. I mean, it's leaving me in a place where we've got to move this forward. The dwell time has to be reduced. This is reactive, it's not preventative. Now, again, like I mentioned, well, I can't patch something until I know there's a patch available or that there's something, there's a vulnerability. Yes, but we can take a lot shorter time than 30 days in order to address that. Now, ultimately, you may say this is operational technology. We can't just shut down to patch for some of these elements. Absolutely fine. If you can contextualize that for your own capabilities within your environment, and you can define the criticality and that there is a dwell time, identify that as part of your process, but communicate that as well, that there is an exposure. Look at underlying capability that could be a compensating control to help protect and to keep these numbers from not only that it's the dwell time, but also leading us to data breach. Again, I just want to say thank you to Qualys for the opportunity, really working and providing guidance in this space. I mean, it's great to work with a number of different organizations, part of this community-driven consensus. It allows me to help contextualize cyber risk. But without the talents, the partnerships, the expertise that exist, ultimately, it doesn't permeate the environment, right? We need to work together. And again, just my thanks to Qualys for the opportunity and for our continued partnership and future successes. And with that, I want to say thank you very much. I appreciate your time. And with that, I'll talk to you soon. Thank you.